Deputy Commissioner for External Affairs. She joined OEM in 2003. She is responsible for the agency's communication with outside entities, including press, the general public, community groups, and private sector partners. She also oversees community outreach and Ready New York and the city's preparedness campaign. Prior to coming to OEM, Ms. Farrell served as Director of New York City Mayor's Office of Grants Administration. She holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and economics from Colgate University and a master's in public administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Joining her today is Roosevelt Island resident Rachel Sulaymanov, OEM Director of Intergovernmental Relations, and again, she's a Roosevelt Island resident, so she knows what goes on here. So give us a hand for Christina Farrell.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for inviting Rachel and me to come out to speak to you. I was actually I oversee CERT as well, and I was at the CERT graduation, I think it was about 7 years ago, and so we're happy that the team has expanded and is a valuable asset, here and in other parts of the city. Rachel and I are going to speak a little bit about the city's new evacuation zones and some changes that have been put into place because of lessons learned after the last 2 storms. And then I have some questions that Ellen was kind enough to forward to me that I think all of you have already forwarded to her that I will we'll talk a little bit about. Rachel can give more of a local perspective. And then, as Ellen said, if you have additional questions, we'll be happy to answer those. So as we said, a lot of this came out of work that actually was beginning before Sandy. If any of you remember, the city's evacuation zones were put in place in 2003. We had A, B, and C. I believe that Roosevelt Island was mainly a B, and that has changed, as we'll talk about a little bit. So these are some pictures that show different hurricane, the old zones, A, B, and C. Just for your reference, the last 2 storms, even though they were obviously very different in intensity and size and impact, they were both actually not even hurricanes when they hit the city, which is kind of bad news for us, I guess. They were tropical storms based on the wind speed and things as they came to us. But in the past, we had 3 zones. We had A, B, and C. And we get all of our information through the National Weather Service. The branch that we work with is out in Brookhaven in eastern Long Island. We're in constant contact with them. If we activate the city's Emergency Operations Center for something significant, such as a coastal storm or a large snowstorm, they actually come in and embed with us and are with us to give us up-to-date forecasts. There are certain things that the Weather Service, based on technology and their work, is good at predicting, and there are certain things that they're not necessarily, they're getting better all the time with technology and things, but some things we're not able to predict so well. One thing that the Weather Service is getting very good at, and we saw this during Irene and Sandy, is the bearing of the storm. If you're familiar with coastal storms, if you ever watch the Weather Channel or see, you know that they start down in the Southern Caribbean, or that's when we start to track them. They come up, and they can kind of go out to sea, if that's the best case for us. If they go out east, obviously they're east of the United States, and we prefer that, but then they can go through these different bearings all the way to west-northwest. And you can see, as you go along, the red on this, the yellow, green, and the orange are the evacuation zones as they stood up until this summer, and the red is inundation and impact on buildings in the city. This is lower Brooklyn, looking at this, so you can see something that's northeast or north-northeast, there's much less impact. As you get into north, you can see the red starts to go up, it starts to get worse, and then as you go to north-northwest, northwest, and west-northwest, that it continues to get a lot worse. So using this information, we started looking at the zones and how we may be able to better use this to inform our decisions as we face what probably will be more tropical storms. So as I think I mentioned, we actually started this work before Irene and Sandy. A lot of this work, a lot of this information came to us back in 2010, based on modeling and very technical things that happened through the Army Corps and other federal partners of ours. Also, as has happened with really everything over the last 10 years, technology has gotten a lot better. The resolution of maps and things that we can get are a lot better. We also have better LiDAR. That's kind of like radar, but it's for this kind of modeling. So we've had people go out in planes over the city and do this technical work. Our old model was based on mean tide. Which at the time was what they chose to do. We now have modeled it based on high tide, which is a worst case scenario, which obviously makes sense to plan for the worst case scenario. Something also, it accounts for bigger, slower storms. As I'm sure you saw with Sandy, Sandy was much bigger than anything we had anticipated, and it was a very slow moving storm, which is good in one way, as it gives us more time to plan and more time to evacuate people, but obviously then when it hits, it lasts for a longer time. So that is pretty challenging. Also, over the last 10 years, the demographics of the city, I'm sure the demographics of this community have changed. People have moved into different areas. Those people may have different risks. They may not speak English. They may not have good socioeconomic means. And so, we also looked at the population estimates of coastal areas and factored that in. And then lastly, obviously, we had 2 real-world events in 2011, and I think tomorrow is actually the 2-year anniversary of Irene. And the day after that, I believe, is the 8-year anniversary of Katrina. So unfortunately, we have a lot of real-world experience, and then everything that we learned from Sandy. If any of you have been following, which I'm sure many of you have, the city has been doing, we did a large after action, which is when we go back and we look at how the city responded, what went well, what challenged us, what we want to change. We did that process through Irene, which was very helpful with Sandy, because a little over a year later we were faced with a much worse storm, and now we're in the process of doing that with everything we learned from Sandy. The city's after action plan that was released, I believe, in May by City Hall is available on nyc.gov if you're interested in seeing the recommendations and the things that came out of that. There's also been city council legislation, which Rachel can tell you about, and the SIR, which is a special initiative for resilience and recovery, which has looked at coastal, global warming and sea temperatures and what the city can expect in 2020, 30, 50 as some conditions change. So we're in the midst of a lot of work to try to get up to speed quickly. So we took all of this, and we were already on this trail, but obviously Hurricane Sandy ramped this up a little bit. So we took our old zones, A, B, and C, and we've turned them into 6 zones. So you can see it may be a little hard. Obviously portraying 6 zones in a color frame is much harder than portraying 3, but the city now has 6 zones. We added about 700,000 people. We used to think a worst case was we would evacuate about 2.3 million people. Now it's upwards of 3 million based on some of the factors that I mentioned before. You can see there, Roosevelt Island in the middle there is, zone 2 at the ends and zone 3 in the middle. We can talk a little bit about what that means and what that means for you. One thing is we went back to our modelers and said, based on these new zones, if Sandy came again, what would the evacuation have been? And they said 1, 2, and 3. So that means there would have been a mandatory evacuation of the entire Roosevelt Island community. One thing we did to get the word out, it's obviously hard to reach 8 million people and to talk about things. One thing we did was we mailed a copy of the guide to every single resident, every single mailbox, or every single business in the zones. Hopefully all of you received a copy of that in your mail. It went out about late June. We did it through the Postal Service as a general mailing, so there could have been some hiccups along the way. There's lots of hurricane guides here today. We've also given them out through the CERT teams and through the elected officials. So hopefully you've seen this information. If you haven't, we have lots of guides here, and that's why we're here tonight. The blue dots are evacuation centers. The way that our coastal storm plan works, after 2005, the city's had a coastal storm plan at least since 2003. But after Hurricane Katrina, when we saw the challenges and what had gone on with that, we looked at our plan and we wanted to make sure that it was operational, that we knew from beginning to end how things would work. So we went through, and the first thing we did was we picked 65, which now we have 64 evacuation centers. These are mostly, they're either, for the most part, for the vast majority, they're either DOE facilities, mostly high schools or middle schools, and also some CUNY facilities. And when we have a storm, such as Irene or Sandy, we open, the first thing we do when mandatory evacuation is called for, is we open each of these centers. They're fully staffed, they have supplies, they have security, you know, they can have upwards of a few hundred people, so they may not be, you know, we urge people to create a plan and to go stay with friends and family. The good news is that this isn't Houston or this isn't New Orleans, so when you see the news of the Contra traffic and people having to travel 90 miles out of Houston, you know, that's not the case in New York City. You know, most people can travel half a mile, and be outside of the evacuation zones, but it's still a big effort, obviously, to relocate yourself, your family, your pets. You know, any special needs that you or your family may have, even if it's just for a couple nights, as it was during Irene, and then for Sandy, for some people it was obviously much longer. We also have 8 special medical needs shelters, which are co-located with some of these evacuation centers. The closest one to here is Julia Richmond High School, which is 68 between 2nd and 3rd, and the one in Queens is Queens College. So those are for people that need you know, a little extra care. They're staffed by health and hospitals employees. They have medical supplies there, and you know, so we work to keep those for people that may have some special needs. Outside of these 64 centers, all of those are open. Many of them we have shelters co-located, but what we do is we work on a solar system. So if you go to a center, what they may then do is transport you to another school. And they kind of do it based on, you know, filling them up. So one may open, a second may open. During Irene, I think we opened about 83 shelters all told, including the centers. During Sandy, it was a smaller number. But we have the capacity to open over 500 centers, and we can house over 605,000 people. I think for Sandy, we at the max housed about 10,000 people, so we obviously have more capacity than we've needed up to this point. Although I think from some of the lessons learned during Sandy, if we had a similar storm, I think that many more people would evacuate into these centers and shelters. As I mentioned, we have a zone finder, which you can go to nyc.gov or call 311. It'll tell you what zone you live in. If you live on the island, you either live in 2 or 3 based on the map. But if you want to know, you know, other locations, where you work, where other family members may live, you can always go on there and find out what zone they're in. As I mentioned, we mailed this to 1.4 million addresses back in late June, and you know, we're going out across the city through hurricane season, which for us ends November 30th. You know, we had thought, kind of historically, that once we got to Labor Day, we could sigh a breath of relief. You know, the water gets cooler generally, things were a little better, but Sandy obviously showed us that, you know, it happened October 29th. So, you know, and then we had a nor'easter a week later, which is something that we hadn't necessarily considered. We always thought more it would be in the summer, it would be hot. How do we help people that don't have air conditioning, that, you know, those kind of things. And all of a sudden we're trying to figure out how do we deal with 6 inches of snow on top of it. But, you know, that's how it worked out. This is just an example of some of the outreach we're doing across the city. I know many of you are involved in many different groups, public, private, nonprofit. If you would like some guides to bring out to your group, if you would like someone to speak, the guide is also available in 10 other languages on our website, and we can make those copies available to you as well. These are just a few other resources. Some of them are here. They're all available on our website or through 311 or talking to Rachel and myself. One I want to point out here is my emergency plan. We used to call this the Ready New York Guide for Seniors and People with Disabilities. But someone who works on our staff is 86, and he took a look at that book and told us, kind of in no uncertain terms, that he really didn't think it was that useful. And so we challenged him to come up with a much better guide, which he did. This is an interactive guide, so you can take copies up here, and when you look through, and I'm sure this is something your CERT team may have guided you through, you can actually build your plan. So there's areas where you can write things in. Thank you. So you can go through this, and you know, we're happy to come back another time if you think it's useful. And so you can go through here. There's spaces where you can write down, you know, special needs you may have, medication, people that don't speak English, or that that are deaf, if they want to write some things down, there's transportation need, you can write what zone you live in. So, you know, this is something we encourage people to put in their go bags. If you have a caretaker, you know, give that person a copy. You can also go online and fill it out that way if you prefer. So this is a really good resource that actually we started out using mainly for seniors, and we've used it more across the board now because we've seen that's a very valuable resource. We also have some hazard-specific guides on pandemic flu, on heat, on flooding. We have guides specifically for children. We go out and do presentations to kids. We have a business guide. So, you know, we have many materials that we're happy to share with you and talk about at length if you're interested. And then last but not least, they already received accolades from Ellen, but I wanted to thank the Roosevelt Island CERT team and then CERT teams in general. We have 53 CERT teams across the city. This is some pictures of teams out in the Rockaways. Many of these are Rockaway residents that obviously were facing great devastation at home, but they put that aside at least a couple hours a day and helped to give out supplies. Up in the corner there, this was the day before the nor'easter. CERT teams had the glamorous job of helping city workers to clear all the leaves because there was obviously early November, a lot of leaves falling down. We were afraid about additional flooding, you know, everything getting clogged up with the extra rain and snow. So they went out and helped us clean out all the catch basins and work with flooding. And then up in the corner, that's a CERT volunteer that helped. There was obviously a great outpouring of donations that we needed help managing. So you know, they're an invaluable resource, and you know, we're always proud to be associated with them. And then I just wanted to mention, September is a few days away. That's National Preparedness Month, which is a big push for us and across the city. This is a picture of Commissioner Bruno, which leads OEM, Craig Fugate, who's the administrator of FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and some of our other partners. We launched some new ads in Times Square a couple years ago at the NASDAQ. We're going to be launching some new ads based on kids and families next week out in Staten Island at the Children's Museum. But, you know, we're active all year long, giving presentations, helping people prepare, but we do an extra push in September, along with the rest of the country, to try to get people to do a little extra preparation. So that is the end of the presentation that we prepared. But as I said, Ellen was kind enough to send me some questions. I put on my glasses. So we will, hopefully some of these we've answered through the presentation.